Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first of our webinars. Hopefully you can all hear me. And if you can't hear me and you can see my mouth moving, please let us know now. It's probably fair to say that we've had a few teething issues with our software. So the keener-eyed amongst you would have seen that we sent a few emails yesterday. Apologies for that. I think we've now resolved a lot of the teething problems. So welcome. It's very humbling and amazing to see so many people joining us from around the world. I've seen that there are people as far off as New York and Australia. We've got lots of people from the Middle East. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Thank you for joining. This is the very first of our webinars in the Light Lunch series. We have another 7 webinars coming up. Please do check out our website or our social media at Nulty Lighting to have a look at the other webinars that we have planned for you. We're planning on doing 2 a week, so hopefully they will be of interest to you all. I'd also like to welcome my colleague Emilio Hernandez to the screen today. Hello,
everyone.
Emilio is going to be lurking in the background moderating this session. If you have any questions, please do fire them off. Emilio will either try and answer them for you in the background, or he will save them off and raise them at the very end of this session. It's the intention that this webinar will last around about 45 minutes. If you have any questions, as I say, please do ask, and we will try and answer them either as we go or afterwards. I've never been so nervous, I have to be honest with you. Of all the presentations I've ever given, I've never given them to a very quiet, silent audience like this. So welcome to the new normal, I guess. And I genuinely hope everybody is safe and well. So somebody's mentioned there's an echo. It might be, if there are echoes, then I would recommend muting your microphones. Often you get feedback on echoes, so I've just seen that. So that would be why. So without any further ado, I will crack on if that's okay. So this first seminar, we've given a couple of times in Madrid and Barcelona. So those of you that have seen me present, I apologize if some of this you have seen before, but we titled this presentation The Art of Light. And before we crack on, for those that don't know us, and I'm sure a lot of people do know who we are a lighting design practice that is based in London and Dubai, but we also have offices in Beirut, Miami, and Bangkok. And this is my picture of my beautiful team in London. I miss them all. We're all currently working from home, so I miss you guys, and I hope that you're all well. We get involved in a kind of weird and wonderful array of projects, ranging from retail projects with people like Manchester United through to wonderful hotel projects. This was an Edwin Lutyens Grade 1 listed building for Soho House in central London, the Ned Hotel. Equally, we work across the Middle East, and we look at sort of large public realm schemes as well. And then this is Keflavik Airport that we worked on a few years ago, where the client wanted us to recreate the Aurora Borealis. And then we've also worked in partnership with lots of engineering firms, people like Chapman Bathurst, for example, at the Design Museum in London. And then we also do spa and wellness work. That's more retail, and then a bit of residential work as well. So we do get involved in a really wide array of projects. So it's safe to say that we are architectural lighting designers. And I always like at this point to really establish not what architectural lighting design is, but more what architectural lighting design isn't. So some of the things I'm about to list really often get wheeled out in meetings as ways of defining what we should or shouldn't be achieving or doing on certain projects, and I often think they're wrong. So allow me to elaborate. So to anybody from Floss, I apologise for using one of your images. But architectural lighting design and good quality architectural lighting design is not about choosing product. It's a long way down the road before we start looking at product selection. And I think a lot of people go wrong when they immediately pick up the manufacturer's catalogue, and I know we have a lot of suppliers and manufacturers joining today, so I apologise. But when people will immediately pick up that catalogue and then start looking at product, it's wrong, because we're not thinking about the intangible thing, which is the quality of light. We're simply looking at the aesthetic of the product, and that's the wrong place to start. Equally, for contractors, I'm sorry to tell you, one of our primary concerns is not initially buildability. Just because it's buildable doesn't make it a decent piece of lighting design. And equally, just because something has a high quantity of light, just because it achieves whatever the current legislation requires in terms of quantity of light, it doesn't make it a good piece of lighting design. And this is where we often fall out with some of the electrical engineers that we work with, because a lot of electrical engineers, and in fairness, developers, they want to quantify light, because then it gives them a nice little box that they can tick, and they can say, yes, we achieve 400 lux, on the desk, or yes, we achieve, 10 lux on the pathway. It's a real problem, because if all we do is rely on the quantity of light, we stop to think about, again, the intangible quality of what we are doing. Equally, yes, okay, any scheme that we design has got to be affordable, for sure. But just because it's on budget, it doesn't mean that it's a good piece of lighting design. Equally, we all have, to be diligent designers, and we all have an obligation to achieve local code wherever that is in the world, whether it's the US or the UK. We still have not dissimilar codes and accreditation, and my colleagues will be giving a seminar on Friday, actually, called The Rules Were Meant to Be Broken, which is specifically about legislation and accreditation. For sure, it's important that we achieve both where possible, but accreditation in particular can be bent and broken because it is not a requirement. And just because we achieve those boxes and we tick those boxes doesn't necessarily mean it's a good piece of lighting design. So why is this? Well, I apologize if anybody's offended, by the way, at this, but why is this? Well, if we achieve, perfect levels of light, it's safe, it's affordable, it's buildable, we potentially end up with a scheme like this. And it's not like they sell anything expensive in here, is it? Let's be honest. BMW i8, expensive vehicle. Yes, there's a functional level of light, but we see this tide mark of light across the wall. It's pretty uninspiring as a space, to be honest with you. And it would be very easy to take a car showroom and do something like this, which was undertaken by Sagittario Lighting. It's Mercedes-Benz showroom. Very simple. It plays with the contrast of the darkness on the ceiling with the whiteness of that Barrasol lighting and the lighting in the floor. I mean, it creates a really beautiful focal point. And yet it still achieves, the functional levels of light. It's still buildable. It still achieves legislation and accreditation. So it's a very simple way of achieving a very powerful solution. Equally, in a supermarket, this was Sainsbury's. I won't name any names, but this won, a couple of lighting design awards, and I have real issues with this as a project because whilst the light fitting is technically, very good, it's an edge-lit piece of acrylic that puts light sideways, so it's relatively efficient. This becomes all about the lighting being the feature. When we walk into the store here, our eye is immediately drawn upwards into the space because the eye is always drawn to the brightest point in a space. So if the eye is drawn upwards, it looks at those light fittings rather than focusing on the merchandise, which is below the eye line or level with the eye line. And the focus and the features should all be down here on the product, on the merchandise, rather than up at the ceilings. So again, Lab 5 architects did a really, really good job on this project for Spar supermarkets. It's linear LED, it's very simple, but it's just putting lighting exactly where it's required. It's on the product. So by lighting the product, the space becomes infinitely more interesting and exciting, and it starts to use a little bit of contrast and drama as well. Equally, in an office space, this is an old kind of early 90s lighting scheme. This is actually one of our projects, not this particular project, but we did the refurbishment of this space. It was for Berghaus, the clothing apparel, the outdoor clothing apparel company here in sunny Sunderland. We get to go to all of the exotic places here. So in Sunderland, we were up there and we were asked to look at their lighting, and we worked very closely with Rock Townsend, the architects and interior designers on the project. And we ended up designing a scheme that looked like this. So we got them to remove all of the ceilings. It became a very industrial space. And as a result, it feels, a heck of a lot better. And it's also worth noting here that that there was a very, very low budget for this. So we're actually using linear fluorescent sources. It's not even LED. They're a Philips Ultralife LED fluorescent source, which is a 50,000 hour lamp life on it. So not dissimilar to LED, and in terms of its efficacy, not dissimilar to LED. So there are always ways around achieving good design, and it doesn't have to be expensive. And in this space, we have a linear LED on the bottom of the cable tray, and then a linear fluorescent on the bottom of the cable tray, and a linear fluorescent on the top of the cable tray. So we create this sort of very inexpensive light fitting that's providing 180 degrees of light, providing a nice bit of visual interest, but really celebrating the volume of that space. And it's a lot more interesting going back. That's exactly the same space. So you see what a difference good lighting and good design, good interior design and good architecture makes. For my Dubai colleagues out there, this one's for you. This is the Rixos in Dubai. I have real issues with this as a piece of lighting design, and this is obviously my humble opinion, which is not always so humble. But I have a problem with this, and the problem I have is that it's a linear LED that is essentially defining or redefining the form of the building. It's a relatively rectilinear tower block for a hotel, and yes, some of the facade has a little fold, which some of this LED is sort of outlining, but the rest of the LED lines actually don't relate to the building at all. And for me, that's a bit like a lighting designer kind of celebrating their own ego, which I don't like. For me, what we do should be about informing the form of a building. What we do as designers and the use of light should be about celebrating the space. So the building becomes an object of the lighting rather than a subject of the lighting. A good scheme here is one of Light Bureau's schemes down in London. It's a very, at least, similar example in that it is using linear lines of LED to create a feature. But here, the linear LEDs are at least positioned such that they are describing and informing the overall shape of the building. I think another great scheme, which has sort of stood the test of time, really, was Howard Branston's lighting scheme for the Petronas Towers. I mean, there is obviously an argument these days against light pollution. So for sure, there's an awful lot of very high-powered uplighting in this scheme. So I'm sure there's a lot of light pollution, but otherwise, I think it is a great piece of lighting design that celebrates the form of the architecture. And really, that's what we should be doing. The lighting design should always be subordinate to the architecture that we're working with. What is the essence then that makes for good lighting design is really what I was saying, and that's kind of what this presentation is really about exploring. So the essence of good lighting design, or to ask another way, what is the art that we as lighting designers and the lighting design community bring to this? And by the way, just to upset the lighting designers in the room, I am in the camp that good lighting design should not and is not undertaken purely by lighting designers. I'm really of that mindset. I think anybody who is selecting a light source, whether it be an architect, interior designer, or somebody's grandmother, I think anybody who is selecting that light source is essentially a lighting designer. So I think it is absolutely critical that everybody who works with that medium of light understands this, because good lighting design is not just the domain of the lighting design industry. And I firmly believe that. So what is the art of lighting design? Well, for me, personally, it's summed up in this one little equation, which is A, P, and L. What do we mean by that? Well, it's architecture, it's people, and it's light. And if we blend the design of our spaces and we use light really well in those spaces, and we really deeply consider the people that are using those spaces, those end users, then what we should get is an emotional response. And as good lighting designers and people working with that medium of light, and it is an amazing medium, by the way, that sort of beautiful, intangible substance that we all work with, then for sure, we should elicit an emotional response, from the people. So that's what we're looking for, and that could be something as simple as Chinese lanterns. Loi Krathong in Thailand. It's an amazing event, and obviously, both Japan and China also has lantern festivals. There is something so incredibly beautiful about that sight of seeing thousands and thousands of these small, little flames. It's not even, artificial light. It's the little flames of light, floating across the sky. It's such an evocative image for sure. And there's a real beauty in that. And that's what we're looking for. So something as functional as an old incandescent light bulb could easily be just as beautiful. It's really about how we use it, and how we look at that quality of light in the space. And how often really do we ever stop to think about the quality of light in a space? Just look at the room that you're in at the moment, wherever you are, and have a real think about what the quality of light is. Here I can see over my shoulder on my camera an LED lamp flickering, which is a bit bad. So that's not a great quality of light, is it? But I've also obviously got daylight coming into the space as well through the windows. I can see part of my face being sort of slightly brighter than the other side of my face. And it's really understanding how that quality of light falls upon a space that we're interested in. This image is from Digital Revolution. It's one of the installations there. It was held at the Barbican in London a few years back. The piece is called Umbrellum or Umbrellium. So it's semblance by Umbrellium. And what was really interesting about this piece was that it was just these intangible disco lights, for want of a better description, moving colored light, and seeing grown adults chase those beams of light around the room and play with them was, absolutely beautiful to see. And this kind of amazing childlike almost quality, that people have when they're trying to interact with that intangible medium. So getting people involved is really interesting. Cloud, I think a lot of people have seen this installation all around the world by Caitlin Brown. Again, you get hundreds of people. There are something like 4,000 or 6,000, I think, light bulbs in this piece, and many of them have little cords that you pull and switch on and off. And again, getting people interacting with light is a really wonderful thing, and it's almost voyeuristic to stand there and watch, but there's something very playful about it, and I think that emotional connection should be celebrated. And this is kind of my point, really. We're always interacting with light in all that we do. Every day, when you stop and you look at the quality of light on my face, making me look beautiful, obviously. But the quality of light around us, it's everything we do. Now, whether that is something as simple as street lighting, very simple street lighting. Think about that rhythm of light that we walk through, the shadows that it casts, the quality of that street lighting, whether it's sodium or white light. What kind of rhythm, what kind of mounting heights are they? What does that do for the quality of light, and how does that work with contrast to the edges of that space? It's a kind of an interesting thing to stop and just think, because we exist so quickly and so fast these days that we don't stop to think about the world around us. And one of the things I keep saying to people is at the moment that if there is a silver lining to this pandemic that we are going through, that it is an opportunity for us all to stop and just take stock of the world around us. So to really think about the light and the way light is falling is quite a beautiful thing. And it could be just something as simple as a desk lamp, for example. And what's really interesting is that we're already, as human beings, particularly in the Western world, already attuned to this, but we don't know it, because when we experience art, we believe it. In theatre, we have this wonderful saying, which is the suspension of disbelief. It's preventing people from disbelieving. Getting them to believe in the space that they're in, getting them to emotionally connect with that space. So we get it in the arts all the time. And I just want to explore that a little bit here. So when we look at this painting by Caravaggio, Cara St. Thomas, what we see here, are arguably 3 or 4 different sources of light from 3 or 4 different locations. So here we have, as we look at the picture, a light source falling over on the left-hand side, as you look at the picture, over the guy's shoulder, coming in at an angle. We have a bit of light coming in from the right-hand side, just cheated in. There's a little bit of light from above as well, as a bit of key. And then there's probably a bit of light cheated just from the bottom. And how do we know this? Well, we can start to look at the shadows and the way the shadows are falling in the picture. So we start to understand the directionality of light, and we can figure it out. When I first went to university, one of the very first lighting lectures I was given was exactly this technique, trying to reverse engineer the light sources in historic art. And it's really interesting to see how artists over the years have cheated cheated light into that art. And this, although they're cheating it, they have to conceive the location of those light sources at the very beginning. What they can't do is paint the picture and then just add the light in afterwards. So a lesson to all of those architects, I would say, and I will repeat this shortly, is that you can't just design a space and then add the light in afterwards and it'll be okay. That relationship between art and light, or architecture and light, has to be one that is sort of seamlessly integrated and seamlessly considered. And just as an example, if we look at the Philosopher in Meditation by Rembrandt, we see the philosopher meditating on the sort of left-hand side with that daylight falling through the window, and then just on the right-hand side we see the housekeeper stoking the fire, which is in that bottom right-hand corner. So we see this beautiful quality of light just creeping up onto the face. But there is also a little bit of light cheated just on that helicopter there. Yep. Just
to chip in there, we've had a question from Tiziano just asking if you could explain what you mean by the quality of light.
Well, I will come on to that. Yes, that's good. It's a very good question. I promise I will answer that when we talk about the quality of light, because quality of light is so many different things. It's more than just great color rendering. It's about the quantity, the directionality, the tonality of it, the rhythm of it. So it's all of these things. I will come back to it, I promise. There's a little section towards the end of this presentation which starts at least to talk about that for sure. So moving on, probably the most famous and iconic painting in the world, arguably, the Mona Lisa by Da Vinci. How many people have ever stopped to think about what the light is doing in the space or on the Mona Lisa? You get a little bit of light at the back falling through the trees onto the river. So you start to see a bit of shadows of the trees just falling across the water. You see that shadow under her chin. You see a very soft quality of shadowing into her eye sockets, and then you get a bit of shadowing around the fingers. So we start to really think about her, and that light and the absence of light, because that's what shadow is, starts to inform the three-dimensionality of it. So of her, I should say, really. So we don't stop. Like I say, we rush through life, and we really rarely stop to think about what the quality of light is doing. In the movies, we are so used to needing light to help tell a story. We do have a wonderful webinar coming up as well, which is being hosted by Sophie Dan Blaker, and we're trying to bring in a very special guest if we can, which is all about movies, and hopefully we're going to be giving you a top 10 lighting movies as well to count down. I think we've all got a bit of time to watch Netflix at the moment, so if we can maybe make some recommendations, we will be doing so for you. So that's coming up, I think, it's either next week or the following week. Thereafter, we have, I better get to, sorry, film noir, for example, movies and the use of light in movies. It is this wonderful substance that is used to tell stories. You can imagine if in this slide by, which is The Third Man by Carol Reed, you can imagine if you didn't have that intense backlighting, you would lose all of the drama. If you didn't have that light grazing across the cobbles, you would lose that texture and that drama. So it's all about light. We don't know if this person is good, if he's bad, who he is. That quality of light or absence of light on the face is a really wonderful thing, but it really helps inform the story and therefore the emotional connection that we have. Blade Runner is one of the most ubiquitous movies in the world for lighting and lighting design. The whole piece is lighting designer's wet dream, to be absolutely honest with you. So again, it really is used to inform that belief that this is set in the future, that the future is this dystopian chaos. So light is a really, really important element to use in the space or in the movie. Aliens, which is one of my most favorite films. I mean, to be honest with you, Aliens is the reason I'm a lighting designer. And it was this opening scene in that second part of the trilogy that really inspired me and captured my imagination. It is a beautiful piece of cinematography. That opening scene where the laser comes into the space and scans the spaceship and allows people to kind of get a sense of what is going on in that space. And gets a sense of the drama of the spaceship. It's one of the most amazing pieces of lighting I've ever seen, and totally inspired me to become a lighting designer. And then there are things like more modern movies, such as La La Land by Damien Chazelle, which uses lots of sepia tones in the lighting. It's again a really wonderful piece of cinematography, but for very different reasons. It doesn't have that high contrast, high drama that something like Aliens or Blade Runner does, but it uses light, the tonality of light in a very, very beautiful way. And all of these movies draw us in. They get us to emotionally connect with the characters in the space. And equally, more conceptual artists do exactly the same thing. People like Dan Flavin with the Untitled series, which is really about pulling the eye through, creating rhythm but tension in the space as well. Or Oliver Eliasson. This has obviously been on show down at the Tate Modern in London over the last several months, actually, towards the end of last year. And it's this kind of, again, a really beautiful, playful installation of light, seeing the shadows cast, but also seeing the multi-coloured shadows that get cast across the piece. So again, it's very engaging. And of course, the king of this is obviously James Turrell. I mean, anybody who is interested in lighting and knows lighting will know who James Turrell is. But his invention of this term Ganzfeld is really interesting. I mean, Ganzfeld is all about breaking down the boundaries of a space. It's all about losing the definition of where the edges are. Is this, in this particular image, is this space, this aperture at the end, is it an aperture or is it a solid surface? Is it lighting or is it architecture? We don't know. And there's a certain tension that it creates, or an interest or a visual interest that it creates. So again, as we're interacting with James Turrell installation, it's all about the quality of light, and it's all about the use of light and tonality. And there are some amazing architectural lighting designers or light artists out there that are doing very similar things. And this is where we start to blur the boundaries between architecture and art, really. People like Cinemod Studio, interactive pieces of light. And Cinemod then took it a step further with their art installations for Snog, where Snog is a frozen yogurt retailer. And what Snog have done incredibly well is use light and that kind of art part of light to really start to define their spaces and to create brand, actually. And it really makes their offer and their brand offer stand out from anything anybody else is doing. And it's all about the power of light. So I think Cinemod have done a really wonderful job working with Snog. And many of their stores have different types of art installations, but it really starts to blur the boundaries between what is art and what is architectural lighting. So a project we worked on a little while ago over in Abu Dhabi. This was for ADNOC, which is the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And actually, when we got involved, the architect had this white backlit barrosol ceiling, so it was very bright. It was a white, bright, underlit floor, and there was lots of other lighting going on. And he said, well, what do? We need more feature. And in the end, our response was, don't add any more feature, take it out. So we ended up designing this space, which was really all about the contrast. So we ended up with this sort of oil black gloss Barosol, or I say other manufacturers of stretch membranes do exist other than Barosol, but Barosol, or a Barosol form of stretch sealing that is gloss black, and it really creates high contrast, and that focuses then the mind on, or the eye on this installation, which is based upon the geography of an oil well. So we create a bit of feature to define the space, but that feature itself is then defined by the contrast in the space. And we could even do that, for example, in something as simple as a residential installation. You know, Lightbureau did it incredibly well here in this private residence. They worked with an artist that punched light through this chandelier, which then created this wonderful dappling of light. So again, we start to incorporate the art into the architecture of the space. And something we did here, this is for Mohammed Al Fayed, one of his private airline lounges. You know, there were no downlights in this space. The architectural lighting is all about highlighting surfaces, and then we create this feature chandelier that starts to blur the boundaries between a piece of art and a piece of architectural lighting. And the same can be said in the exterior spaces. You know, if we start to just illuminate surfaces rather than cluttering a space up. I apologize to anybody that might be selling, you know, street lights and columns and bollards, but we're not interested in them. We're interested in defining the space itself and using light to define the space, so we can start to emotionally connect people. We can start to emotionally connect people to their spaces and environment. So the art of lighting, for me at least, and for us at Nulty, is very much about blurring the boundaries between light, art, and architecture. And I think that's when it starts to become quite successful. So projects like Nike, for example, is a pop-up space, which is very much about creating a really interesting sort of exhibition space more than a retail environment. Selfridges do it really well. This was all about integrating lighting into shoji screens and these Japanese style light boxes. And trying to take the eye away from the architectural lighting hardware. So what is the role of the lighting designer in all of this? Well, it's kind of an interesting question. And for me, I would insert designer here, not just lighting designer, because as I said earlier, we are all lighting designers if we are choosing a light fitting and choosing the location of that light fitting. So if I was a bit pompous, I could possibly say, you know what, more than a lighting designer, I am a surface designer, because we are very much interested in the interplay of light on that surface for sure. And whether that is that we want a black surface to create as much contrast as we possibly can and potentially pull the eye downwards rather than upwards, or is it about grazing light to reveal texture on surfaces? Whatever it is our job as lighting specifiers or lighting designers to really make sure that our clients understand the interplay of light and surface and how they are going to react to each other. It is not just about choosing a light fitting. So that could be that it's even, you know, using a gloss surface and putting a saturated light onto a saturated color. I know there are not too many you know, Manchester United fans in the room. I saw a few people booing before, which I understand. You know, I'm a Brighton and Hove Albion fan and very much missing my football. But what's really interesting here at Manchester United, what we did was just put red light into this tunnel. So this is the entrance tunnel into the store after you have been through the stadium tour. And what we find is that anybody wearing a blue top, if you happen to be a Manchester City or a Chelsea fan, well, you're going to find red light onto that blue is really going to kill it. You know, it's going to look muddy. Whereas anybody wearing a red top, like a Manchester United top, is going to pop. And we're really going to make that red look amazing. And that's what it's all about. It's our job as lighting designers then to focus attention. And these are all elements. When somebody asked earlier on, what is it about a good quality of light? What defines a good quality of light? Well, these are all facets of what defines a good quality of light. So good focusing. This is one of the largest department stores in central London. This is Liberty. And as you can see here, the light is really well focused on the floor. We have a mannequin on the right-hand side with no direct light onto it. Okay, we have some retail merchandise on the left-hand side there, which has got some pendants over it. But largely speaking, the light, as you can see, is hotspotting on the floor. Well, that's not a good quality of light, is it? That's not a great piece of lighting design, because Liberty, as far as I know, don't sell timber floors. They're trying to sell, the garments, fashion. And again, another example. So you see here, no direct lighting onto the mannequin. There's some spotlights on the floor. It's very poorly focused. And we have many discussions with visual merchandisers about this, because a lot of the time, particularly on retail projects, the lighting designer comes in, we design it, we focus it, it's commissioned. And then we find, later on down the line, stuff gets moved around. It's, the space will be re-merchandised. And visual merchandisers who do that are not trained to look at the quality of light, and they're not trained to then refocus and re-aim the spotlights onto merchandise, and they just don't think about it. So it's one of the things we try and train. We often try and convince our clients, unsuccessfully, to take out service agreements to ensure that the lighting is refocused on a regular basis, but not many retailers are willing to pay for that cost. And when things come to be maintained, electricians, God bless them, will change the lamps, no problem at all. And they might even refit the light fitting if it's LED. But again, they've no clue about where that light should be focused. So there isn't enough training. Actually, I think it's incumbent upon us as a lighting industry to really find ways of training and educating people so that they better understand the use of light in a space. So they understand, again, what light is doing and how it's falling in the space, and they can start to think about where light should be pointed. It's particularly important in the retail world. And I can assure you, when we get out of this corona pandemic, the retail world is going to be in a state of sink or swim. And those that are able to swim, as it were, those that are able to roll with the changes, will be updating a lot of their retail environments, because it's much more experiential than it ever has been before. And I think we're going to have 3, 4, 5 months of people getting very used to shopping online. So I think the high street's in for an even more torrid time than it has been as of late. So
Paul, we've got a couple of questions here, just on the topic of using light to blur the boundaries between lighting and architecture. And some people are interpreting that as trying to conceal it a bit more, and others are perhaps thinking it's more about using light to shape the space. So how would you apply to that?
They're a good point. I mean, for me, if I quickly jump backwards, I think it's a bit of both, to be honest with you. I think when we look at things like, maybe it's a bit further back, the sorry, I'm just going to jump backwards, apologies, to the FIRE scheme. That's very much about defining the boundaries of the space. More slides than I'm back than I thought it was. Here, we look at this scheme, it's very much about cove lighting. We've got a trough in the floor that's uplighting the wall. There's a cove at the top, which is grazing light across the wall. And then we've got this coffer, and then it's contrasting with the cool color temperature of that piece of art, or that pendant, that chandelier. So it becomes very much about blurring the boundary. I mean, for me, the best light fitting out there is a cove. We often get journalists ringing us up asking, what's your favorite light fitting? And for me, it's always, well, it's a cove, because it's the perfect seamless boundary, or between architecture and lighting. So blurring that boundary, I think, is really important. But yes, we can also use light to shape the space or create feature within that space, for sure. So I think it is a combination of both, and I think it's up to the diligent designer to decide, what is important. In this scheme for Aviva, the insurance firm, we created this sort of feature above that actually then runs down the walls as an unilluminated feature here. And that is about creating shape and visual interest in the space without it sort of blurring boundaries too much. So to answer the question, Amelia, I think it is a bit of both, to be really honest with you, but done in a really well considered way. I'm going off on tangent, I apologize. Getting back to quality of light and focusing. So these are really bad examples. A good example, Hollister and Abercrombie. Now, admittedly, Hollister and Abercrombie are probably the only spaces where the emergency lighting is brighter than the actual lighting. But we did work with Superdry a few years ago. And Superdry were interesting because they came to us and said, our core market, our demographic is the same demographic as Hollister and Abercrombie, and we want a bit of that. So we want to recreate it. And they really went after trying to sort of recreate that feeling. But we actually worked very closely with them. And in the end, we managed to convince them that didn't necessarily mean having to have light levels that are so low, because it really is more about contrast and drama. So in the end, whilst we retained around a 10:1, 12:1 contrast ratio, we just lifted all of the light levels, which means people that are old like me can still go in and actually see what I'm buying. I don't have to take it outside or over to a window to see. Good focusing. Here's a scheme by one of my colleagues, Anna, at Selfridges. This is very much a very simple piece of retail lighting design. It's just spotlights, but it's all about spotlighting the merchandise, which means we end up with this sort of shadowing, or we end up with this sort of dropping off of light through the center of the space. But it very much focuses the eye exactly where it's needed, because Selfridges are into selling fashion. They are selling these goods, so that's where we want to focus the eye and attention. And going back to Lab 5, they did a really good job on that Spar supermarket. So it doesn't need to be high end. It doesn't need to be complex. Good lighting design and the good quality of light is also about enhancing brand and helping people create, a brand identity. I love Apple. I'm a big Apple fan, much to the consolation of a lot of my team. But Apple, they are a brand that is all about being accessible. It's about being easy to use because it just works, as Steve Jobs used to say. So it's interesting that their stores are all about, feeling natural. They've introduced over the last few years these trees, which I'm led to believe go on holiday every 6 weeks because they need more light. I don't know whether that's a rumor or not, but that's what I'm led to believe. But we have this actually very energy hungry solution because it's a Barosol or a stretch ceiling membrane, which is back illuminated or rear illuminated. So it's a lot of light in that space. And the light is designed to feel very natural, very simple, very calm. And it reinforces that brand and the accessibility of the brand. And I know that Apple are going one step further now. They've even started introducing gobo projectors to fake that feeling of sunlight and dappled sunlight coming through the trees. So they use light very carefully to sort of reinforce their brand identity. And it's something we've done with corporate brands as well. This is for an insurance underwriting firm whose logo was a brightly colored barcode. So when you walk into this space, this lift lobby comes to life, and this interactive wall sort of follows you around depending wherever you're walking. And people like Hakkasan do this really well. Hakkasan have their blue color, which they really use to great effect to reinforce their brand identity. As I mentioned before, it's also about enhancing finishes. So, I think anybody who's been in lighting, for longer than 3 or 4 years will absolutely know all about the advent of higher CRIs. I think we take it for granted these days. But when I first started using LED, we were at kind of CRI 75, maybe 80 if we were lucky. So it was pretty poor color rendering onto product. But now, of course, we have very high color rendering quality. And it enables us to really sort of enhance products. So you can see here just on these strawberries that if we use a better color rendering, a higher color rendering, then that red is really going to pop. Likewise in fashion. And one of the things we see, we worked very closely with Estee Lauder and Charlotte Tilbury and another number of beauty brands. And a lot of beauty brands struggle because clients, particularly women, go into store, they have their foundation color matched to their skin tone, and then they go home and they find out that it's it's not the right color. If you're from Essex, it may well be the right color orange that you're looking for. I'm not sure. Hopefully there's nobody from Essex that I've offended. So yeah, we actually worked very closely with Zaccato to develop a special LED chip, which is specifically for lighting of skin tone. to really help skin tone pop. So it's a higher CRI, but it's also shifted on the black body locus as well. So it really helps get a much better quality of light for makeup, and also for hair as well. And what we find now is that these beauty brands that we're working with are having less makeup returned as a result, which is adding to their bottom line, because they're not able to resell these products. And if you go and get your foundation color matched, you take it home, it's unfortunately it's a perishable item. It's classed as a perishable item, so it then unfortunately can't be resold. So if they're able to better color match, then it means there's less likelihood of returns and more likelihood of happy customers. Yeah, let's work with Charlotte Tilbury. And we've also, worked. This now features in Time Out's top 10 places to visit in London. So when we're all let out again, please go and have a look at it. If you haven't seen it, it's Leek Street Arches. It's the only place in London where graffiti is legal. The quality of lighting here, so the light sources we've used are Zicato, a mixture of Zicato Artist Series LED chips, and then some standard chips. I think some vibrant chips in there, I think. And it's basically the same quality of CRI, the same quality of light as you would get somewhere like the National Portrait Gallery. This is gallery level lighting, but done in such a way that it feels a bit more raw. So it helps retain that identity of this being an urban artist's environment. And it's amazing. On Fridays and Saturdays, they have curated events down here. So it's a really amazing space to go and visit. I'd put it in your list of places or things to do when we are allowed out again.
Paul, before we move on one more, we've just got a question here from Hanny just asking, essentially, is there a rule of thumb or a cultural relationship in terms of how much light you need for retail?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, and probably one, dare I say, for another day, only because, the short answer is yes, there are huge cultural differences depending on what we're doing. In the Middle East, they like cooler. There's a lot more cool light. Typically speaking, in Europe, we like much warmer light for retail. So culturally, yes, there is an impact, but it's culture and brand that impacts it as well. We're working with an optical retailer at the moment, both in Scandinavia, Europe, and in Australia. They have a presence, and there are very real differences in the light levels that are required and the quality of that light as well. So that's an interesting. Very interesting sort of debate that we're having internally as a practice as well, as you well know, Emilio. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is I'll pull a CPD together for another day to explain what they are. Yeah, your colour. I think we as the lighting world are probably guilty of using too much colour, and I think it should be used sparingly and in the right places. So, I think in terms of a tourist destination, Keflavik Airport and the Northern Lights are synonymous. So I think it's absolutely the right use of colour there for sure. But I wouldn't want to use colour. My colleagues in Dubai, I think we are all probably too guilty or guilty of using too much light, too much coloured light where unnecessary. So I think it's really important that we consider it wisely. One of the great things about lighting is that it can actually create permeability as well. This is TK Maxx. It's an interesting project because you wouldn't know whether it's closed or whether it's open. So, a real interesting, it's a problem a lot of retailers and hospitality venues have. You just can't see whether or not stores or bars and restaurants are open. And why is that? Well, it's actually because people don't consider the foreground, middle ground, and background. And what actually happens a lot of the time as designers, we think, what we have to do is we have to light the foreground. So we all in retail spaces shove loads of light in the window areas, and we don't think about what's happening beyond that threshold. And we really need to consider that because, as I said right at the top of this presentation, the eye is always drawn to the brightest point in a space. So we really need to think about where we want the eye to be focused. Do we want the eye simply to be focused at the doorway? And in this particular image, it's not even focused on the doorway. There's just no light. Do we want the eye to be focused on the doorway, or do we want the eye to be drawn all the way through? Well, how do we do that? Well, take DKNY, for example. Here there is this huge light box that wraps all the way around the threshold of that window, which is great. It captures the eye, it gets people's attention as they're walking past the store. But if we don't consider what's going on inside that store, again, it doesn't look particularly inviting. It's not particularly interesting. So we really need to consider what's going on in the midground as well. And then we want to consider what's going on at the background. And on this particular project, we ended up with 1,000 lux at the front of the space, 1,200 lux in the middle of the space, and then 1,500 lux, or just under 1,500 lux, at the back of the space. So we actually ramp the levels of light up in order to make that space as permeable as possible, so the eye gets drawn all the way through that space. And that can be done very simply, with a corridor. This is from Harrods Wellness. This is just an oculus, it's a stretched ceiling oculus at the end of the corridor, which just creates a full stop to look at. It's all about drawing the eye through that journey and creating permeability. And retail spaces do it all the time. Coves are a really easy way of doing that, lighting those walls, drawing the eye through to create permeability. And of course, if we don't have surfaces to light, well, then we can do that by creating features, whether that's some kind of feature chandelier that just draws the eye through the space. Rhythm is also something that's key to a good quality of light. It doesn't have to be particularly complicated, but really considering the spacing of luminaires and the effect of light that's being given, I think is really critical. So it's really easy to see here with these bollards that they're just simply creating a nice rhythm that draws the eye all the way along. If they weren't there, or they were further spaced, then you wouldn't necessarily get that same quality of rhythm through the space. And again, this is a Light Bureau project that also sort of celebrates rhythm of light through drawing the eye through the tunnel and around this bend at the end of this tunnel. It draws the eye through quite nicely. Quality of light, one of the other facets of it is contrast and drama, for sure. And in retail in particular, we see this a lot. And typically speaking, we associate high contrast with higher quality, higher cost retailing, and we associate low contrast with lower cost retailing. And there is a reason for that, and that's typically around merchandising. Often the lower cost retailers have a very high turnover of product, so they are forever moving their stuff around and they can't afford to faff around with the lighting. So the net result of that is we end up with relatively uniformly illuminated spaces, but it's still possible to create contrast through changing the surface color, changing the surface design. So in this particular project, we worked with the interior designers and we ended up with a black ceiling against a white ceiling, which creates that contrast, even though it's a relatively uniform quality of lights across the space. And again, this is what I mean about uniform lighting. So from Fenwick, so it is very soft, it's very diffuse. They turn over, they're not a cheap supplier. They're not down there with like the H&Ms of the world or the Primarks, but nonetheless, they re-merchandise very frequently. Equally, people like Victoria Beckham, very high contrast. It is light only where it is required, which is on merchandise. Much higher cost, much higher value product. They change, and these are permanently fixed shelves, so these shelves are not going to move anywhere. So it is all about spotlighting the merchandise on those shelves. And that can be done really inexpensively. I love this scheme. It's not one of ours. It's by Miller and Howard Architects. Ono Wine Shop. It was shortlisted for a lighting design award a few years back. It's a piece of linear LED. That's all it is, that runs on each of these frames that we're seeing here. And there are wine bottles that are connected to those frames. And then the LED just lights across the labels of the wine bottles. It's absolutely beautiful and stunning. And it is simply LED tape. So good lighting design does not need to be expensive. So contrast, as I mentioned earlier on, does not necessarily mean to be dark. At Selfridges, it's very much about keeping the contrast levels, but raising the overall light levels. So we maintain this feeling of contrast, even though the light levels are not dark. And the same at DKNY there in Bond Street. One of the other things we need to consider as lighting designers is the difference between vertical and horizontal illumination. We see a lot in the legislation and a lot on the guidelines that we all work with, where they are requesting, horizontal illuminance, 400 lux on the desk, for example, 100 lux in the corridor. But that tells us nothing about the quality of light. And actually, we experience most space by vertical surfaces. When we walk into a room, the things we notice first, because our vision is significantly wider, our peripheral vision is significantly wider left to right than it is up and down. So we actually experience that letterbox view, that verticality of a space. So getting good light and washing those walls is really important, and it's more important sometimes than lighting the horizontal surfaces. And we see that again in Victoria Beckham. Wash the walls, it feels much lighter and much brighter. Whereas, if we don't do that, the space will feel very different. And again, KPMG, it's all about washing those vertical surfaces. Because we experience surfaces by the verticality of them, what it actually means is it helps quite a lot with wayfinding in a space, because the eye is drawn to the brightest point in the space. If it's a nicely illuminated vertical wall, then what we actually see is the desks, and we start to naturally understand where we've got to navigate. So it really helps helps aid signage and wayfinding for sure. And of course, if we don't like the horizontals, if we don't like the verticals, and we end up back with our horizontal lighting, we end up with something like this, which we discussed before. Not that inspiring, not that interesting. Yes, it's functional, but it's not great, to be honest with you. And again, one of the examples I often use is actually Trafalgar Square in London. One of the most famous squares in the world. You can walk into the middle of that with a light meter, and in Trafalgar Square, if you're lucky, you might get 2 or 3 lux, if you're lucky, on the floor. And yet it feels much brighter because of all of the vertical surfaces around the square being illuminated. Lillian Baylis School here is a great example. Again, you pretty much got 0 lux actually on the floor, but all of the walls were illuminated, so it feels very welcoming. So the vertical lighting is really important. The integration of light is also important. There are lots of opportunities. The wonderful thing about LEDs these days is they are miniature and tiny, which means we can work with architects and interior designers, and we can get them as integrated as we possibly can, which we couldn't do years ago. So what a great opportunity. Of course, it does mean that we as lighting specifiers also need to have a greater handle and a greater understanding of architectural and interior design detailing than we ever have, because we need to understand how that LED is going to fit under that shelf or within that handrail, for example. So we can achieve really beautiful integrated details. Here's a great story for you. As I mentioned earlier on, good lighting design isn't just about all these factors, it is all of these factors, and energy saving is really important. And I won't dwell on this for too long, but here's a great example. TK Maxx came to us with that store that looked unilluminated, and this is what it looked like inside. Lots of spotlights, but TK Maxx are very into energy saving, and they're very aware of their bottom line. So they want to save money because it saves on the electricity bill. So they had what we term in the trade as over-optimized their lighting. They had spaced their light fittings apart a little bit too much. And the space felt pretty dark and pretty gloomy, if I'm honest with you. And they said, look, we need a better lighting design, but actually we also want to save 20% energy. How do we go about doing that? So we looked at it and we almost said, there's no chance, if I'm honest with you, we can't help you, but we like a challenge and we work with them on it. And what you see on the right-hand side here is their existing design. And on the left-hand side was the design that we developed, which was based upon a linear LED source with a metal halide spotlight. This was 4 years ago. And at the time, when we looked at LOR, light output ratio of the luminaire, it was almost like for like with LED. Obviously LED has now overtaken it, but when we look at like for like, it was very similar at the time. So we ended up with metal halide spotlights, but linear LED. We actually increased their light levels. Their light levels were around 600 lux on merchandise, which is very low. We increased their light levels to between 800 and 1,000 lux, and 1,000 lux on the vertical surfaces. And we did our calculations, and we said to them, we think probably if we do this, we're going to save you around 40% energy reduction, which they were, as you can imagine, incredibly happy with. And then we got our very proactive client to monitor the electrical supply and tell us whether or not we were right. So this is what it was. This is what it ended up being. It's never going to win awards for sort of beauty, but TK Maxx are not that kind of retailer. TK Maxx are very much a retailer that is, fast SKUs, fast turnover of merchandise. So they wanted something very simple. And what we actually found is, and the energy line here is the black line that we're looking at. What we actually found was that we were absolutely correct. We managed to reduce the energy consumption by 40%. So with a bit of good planning and good understanding of light, then it worked really very well. I promise you we're going to finish up soon. So there's just a last couple of points from me. One of the key factors in good lighting design is about layering the light. We actually talk about there being 5 layers of light, and any good lighting design is ultimately a balance between all 5 of those layers of light. So those 5 layers of light, for everyone's information, are accent lighting, ambient lighting, feature lighting, and then we have the 2 new ones, the new kids on the block, which are signage and wayfinding lighting. And then the one that causes us all a headache, and that is electronic advertising media. So screens, basically digital screens. Particularly in the retail world, it causes havoc because we cannot control what the adverts are going to be and what the media is going to be. So we have to work very closely with retailers to establish a maximum and minimum candelas per meter squared, so we've got at least some control over what the levels of light are going to be, even if we can't necessarily control what the color or the tonality of that light contribution is going to be. So they are interesting, but good lighting design is very much a balance and a blending of all of those. Even here on this on this residential project, you can see a nice blending of ambient lighting from that cove and a bit of feature lighting, and then some accent lighting within that chandelier. And we see the same things here in Bloomingdale's in Q8, accent lighting from spotlights, ambient lighting from the ceiling, media lighting from the screens. There's a bit of signage and wayfinding in here as well. So it is very much about that composition and balance, and that's what we're really interested in. The composition and balance is a very simple thing. Here, this is a bar that we worked on in Clapham. As you see here, the pendants on the left-hand side are actually deliberately hung roughly at the same height as the pendants on the right-hand side. The under-counter lighting on the left-hand side is deliberately at the same height as the banquette lighting to the rear of the banquette on the right-hand side. What we do is we create 2 tram lines that draw the eye through and into that space. So it aids permeability, and we resolve that composition that way. And composition is important because it allows us to completely change the look and feel of a space. This is the same space. Okay, it's a model, but it's illuminated in 4 different ways, and the space looks and feels very, very different. And you can see that in a simple meeting room or over a meeting table. Here is a law firm that we work with. Very, very low ceiling height, 2.4 meter high ceiling height, so really quite low. And we wanted that to feel much lighter and brighter. So we ended up inserting illuminated ceiling panels into the ceiling so that we could visually lift the eye up. The eye is always drawn to the brightest point in the space, as I said earlier on. So if we lift the eye up, we create that lighting above us, it decompresses the space, it makes it feel lighter and brighter. However, if you want the space to feel more intimate, then actually we want to create that datum line much lower down. So we want to prevent the eye from going up to the ceiling. So we want a dark soffit or dark ceiling. And then we don't want something glowing. We want something that's very directional. So our brightest surface becomes the table surface. It really draws the eye down. Dynamic lighting is also something, a time and a place. A lot of retailers out there for sure want, dynamic lighting. It works really well. In the UK, we have this wonderful saying, you can't polish a turd, but you can roll it in glitter. Well, this is very much about that. This is a shopping mall in Crawley, which is a 1980s hideous piece of architecture. but we created a 125-meter long light sculpture that undulates all the way through the space, draws the eye away from the architecture, and creates a really lovely piece of feature. But dynamic lighting also is important. We're seeing high-end retailers now, for example, introduce it into fitting rooms, so that people can see what they look like at night. So, if I decide that I want to go and buy a frock, a lovely dress, I can see what I look like in that dress, in a nightclub scenario, for example, or during daylight scenarios. So it's a really kind of cool way of giving people additional flexibility. But also, and here's the weird thing now, we have the Instagram generation. The ability to light for selfies is really important. And so now we're getting enhanced quality of light onto the face. So we're getting really good vertical lighting onto the body, so it flatters the body and the face. So that we get as good a quality of light onto the face as possible for that beautiful selfie. Isn't it great? That's that generation we now live in. And obviously health and well-being has a key role. My colleague Emilio will be talking about a manifesto for a good night's sleep as one of the upcoming webinars that we have. And Emilio will be looking at that for sure. But health and well-being is incredibly important. We know that light has this wonderful role to play in the production of melatonin and serotonin. So we can enhance people's alertness in the right ways if we so want to. One of the best examples I've seen of this, not one of our schemes, was the Blue Lagoon Hotel, where we have the lighting behind the ceiling linked up to the alarm clock, so that at night when we go to sleep, the lighting is very, very warm, because we don't want lots of blue lights, because it's the blue light that triggers our hormone production. So we want warm lights, it's nice and warm and cozy. And then as your alarm goes off in the morning, just before the alarm goes off, the light starts to turn on, so that as we come out of our slumber, the light's already coming on, the curtains have automatically opened, the quality of light is much cooler because it's more akin to daylight. And suddenly the lighting and our alarm clock are connected, and it really helps with the quality of light. And it means we don't get ripped out of our sleep by an alarm clock, because I get very grumpy in the mornings if I'm woken up early, for sure. So I think it allows us to use light to the advantage, to the advantage of a guest in a hospitality project, to aid the sort of squashing or aid jet lag, at least, and prevention of jet lag. So just to wrap up from me, last couple of things really. I mean, the art of lighting design is the art of understanding people, really. And we have this wonderful toolbox which ultimately equates to quality of light. We have all of these wonderful things that we can use as elements, and if we use them right, then we will get this wonderful quality of light. And if we get a wonderful quality of light, then we start to blur the boundaries between architecture and lighting, and then we start to engage people, because what we're really interested in is engaging people with their environments, and that's the most important thing we do as people writing, as people lighting and working with lights. And just to go back to that image of Louis Vuitton, really, it is the simplest of light that is emotionally engaging. And I think, my tip to anybody is don't overcomplicate things. Really understand, why, what, and how we're lighting a space, and then we don't overlight it. So to finish, lighting design is very easy. Anybody can do it, because it is simply the language used to facilitate communication between a person and their designed environment. But the art of lighting design, the getting it right, is very subtle, and it is incredibly complex. So, my advice to clients, get a professional involved, obviously. If you're interested in finding out more, thank you so much to everybody that has joined us today. If you are interested in finding out more, please check out our social media channels, usual social media, Twitter and Instagram, at Nulty Lighting. We have a wonderful blog as well on our website, nultylighting.co.uk. My colleagues from Nulty Bespoke, our sister company, have a webinar tomorrow, which you can see find more information on their website, I believe, and their social media channels, www.nultybespoke.co.uk. Their webinar is on the beauty of glass and the interaction of light. So that'll be a really interesting seminar, and it's a lot shorter than this one has been. I don't normally go on for this long, so thank you for bearing with me. At this point, Emilio, if there's been any amazing questions or anybody has anything to say, I would be delighted to ask questions. Otherwise, I shall draw breath. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, everyone. So just Paul finishing there on the page showing the up and coming webinars. We've got a few, just a couple of questions really that might be good to end on. One from Ruby, just asking if we have a handbook or set of guidelines for retail lighting. I know this is something that we've done in sort of CPD format before. Yeah,
the short answer is no, but I would be delighted to explore the idea of pulling something together for sure.
Okay, brilliant. And one more question, just are there any other tips in terms of using light to lift or raise residential ceilings other than coffers? Or
yeah, well, I mean, to me, I don't like peppering the ceiling with ceiling acne, you know, lots of spots in the ceiling. I think good residential lighting is all about creating intimacy where it's required, which is really, you know, when we think about, you know, what we were used to when we lived in our caves, it was all about firelight, warm quality of light from below the face, up lighting. So for me, I think residential lighting is all about creating pockets of light within the space, lighting into the corners, using table lamps, using uplights, using anything that comes upwards, and then just, you know, using spotlights for, you know, illuminating key features like tables or artwork, for example. Excuse me.
Brilliant. Well, thanks a lot. So thanks to everyone from the 25 or so countries that's dialed in today. That's fantastic. I'll post, we had a lot of thank yous on the chat, so I'll wait for those to slow down a bit and post our YouTube channel link again, and a link to our Instagram as well. This
will be up on YouTube hopefully in the next 24 to 48 hours. Please keep an eye out. We have a YouTube channel which Emilio will post. So and yeah, we are presenting again on Friday at 12:30 British Summer Time. I believe that's Kale and Emilio. Is it? Is that on Friday? I'm lying. No, am I lying or am I not lying? I don't think I am.
So not Friday. It's Good Friday this weekend. So our next presentation's on Tuesday next week, 7th of April. And on that note, Paul has left the room, much to our delight. So I'll be posting the Instagram and YouTube links shortly once all the thank yous stop rolling in. Thanks a lot, everyone. Much appreciated.